More than half of humanity today lives in cities, yet for almost all of human time, there were none. Civilization is not a straight road, but a tangled river with many sources, food surpluses, shared stories, law, trade, and technology braided together over thousands of years until strangers could cooperate at scales once unimaginable. That cooperation made cathedrals, observatories, libraries, and power grids possible, but it also demanded rules and resilience when floods, wars, or plagues arrived. The point of this journey is to show how small changes stacked into world-changing systems. What follows is a narrative that begins with the first farms and ends with a world of satellites and digital markets. Each section of this video asks why a shift happened, how it spread, and what it changed for ordinary people as well as rulers. You will hear about fields and temples, caravans and ships, alphabets and algorithms. The focus stays global so that the Nile and the Yellow River share the frame with the Andes and the Indian Ocean. The goal is simple: understand how we got here so the next chapter can be written with clearer eyes. But before we get started, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more ominous history documentaries. We greatly appreciate your support. 10,000 to 3000 BC Neolithic revolutions. People learned to make landscapes produce more food than a wandering band could eat, and that knowledge reset human possibility. In several places at once, foragers began tending wild stands of grain, penning goats and sheep, and saving seed for the next season. The first harvest did not look like modern fields. They were patches along rivers and lakes, managed by memory and patience. Yet surplus changed time itself, because stored grain extended the present into the future and created new kinds of obligation within the village. Once food could be saved, someone had to keep track of who stored what. Counting stones, pebbles, and marks on clay appeared alongside granaries as tools for memory. Property as a social fact followed, bringing arguments over boundaries, water rights, and inheritance. Ritual became a kind of contract that bound families together at planting and harvest. The village was not only a place to sleep, it became a calendar that set the rhythm of a year and a map that divided labor by age and skill. Domestication worked in both directions because people shaped plants and animals while wheat and cattle shaped people. Diets narrowed around staple crops, and that raised the risk of famine when a single species failed. Work grew more repetitive and seasonal injuries increased as stone hoes and wooden plows demanded long hours. Even so, population rose because more babies survived when food was predictable and shelters stayed in one place. Villages expanded, and nearby woodlands retreated as firewood and building materials were pulled inward. Inequality crept in quietly when some families could mobilize more hands or claim the best plots. Prestige objects such as polished stone axes, fine beads, and rare shells marked status in graves. Councils of elders and ritual specialists emerged to manage disputes and lead ceremonies at thresholds of the year. Power was still personal and temporary, but it set a pattern for leadership that later states would formalize. The Neolithic revolutions were not one event, but a series of experiments repeated across generations until the balance tipped towards settled life. In that slow tipping lies a powerful lesson. Civilization begins when knowledge about plants, animals, and seasons becomes a shared inheritance rather than a private trick. From that shared inheritance grew fields, walls, and the first hints of a civic order. 3,500 to 2000 BC. Birth of cities and states in river valleys. The earliest true cities rose along great rivers where water, silt, and sun met at the right angles of a plow. In Lower Mesopotamia, in the Nile floodplain, in the Indus Basin, and along the Yellow River, farmers and fishers clustered around temple platforms and storage yards. Irrigation demanded coordination, and that coordination crystallized into offices with seals, tablets, and authority. A city was a promise to manage risk together, and a declaration that strangers could live side by side without constant fear. Temples organized labor and sacrifice, while palaces emerged to direct defense and tribute. Streets filled with workshops for potters, metalworkers, and weavers, and markets became daily theaters where grain, beer, and textiles changed hands under accepted weights and measures. City walls signaled security to the countryside, drawing more families into the orbit of urban life. A city also amplified imagination because ideas could travel faster across a few streets than across 100 miles of farmland. Law took shape as administrators learned to translate custom into rules that could be recorded and enforced. Disputes over land, water, and debt moved from shouting matches to hearings before officials who were meant to be impartial. Standardized rations paid workers on large projects and created a sense of fairness tied to measurement rather than mood. That shift anchored trust in institutions and not only in personalities. Ritual did not disappear in this new order. It transformed into civic ceremony linked to urban identity. Processions honored gods who were thought to protect the whole settlement rather than a single clan. Calendars woven from celestial observations guided planting and sacrifice, tying heaven to the schedule of human work. The city became a mirror of the cosmos, with avenues lined up against the rising sun or the flow of a sacred river. These riverine states did not only manage fields, they invented a style of life in which administration, faith, trade, and craft reinforced one another. When a canal was dug, an archive gained a tablet, a temple gained an offering, and a family gained food. The whole was larger than the sum of its parts, and that surplus of order became the engine of early civilization. 3200 to 2000 BC, writing numbers, and the administrative revolution. Writing began as a tool for keeping promises that outlived a voice. Clay tokens that once stood for jars of oil or baskets of barley were pressed into tablets, and the impressions became signs that anyone trained could read. A scribe did not only record payments. A scribe made it possible for a field hand to be paid fairly a month after the work was done, and for a temple to audit its storehouses at the end of a season. Words turned into instruments that carried trust across time. Numbers guided the same transformation because counting and measurement made fairness visible. Standard jars, lengths of rope, and sets of weights meant that two merchants could bargain without knowing each other, confident that a third party would measure the goods. Interest rates and loan terms could be set and checked against what was written. That transparency limited some forms of abuse and created room for enterprise to grow inside rules. Seals and signatures embedded identity into the system. When a cylinder seal rolled across wet clay, it left a design that could stand in for a person who was absent. A shipment of grain or copper could move through several hands without losing accountability because every step left a mark. Bureaucracy sounds dull until you see it as a technology that lets strangers cooperate at scale without constant fear of betrayal. The administrative revolution also opened space for imagination. Once you have a script for counting grain, you can adapt it to record hymns, proverbs, and legal decisions. Once you write down a boundary, you can also write down a myth of origins that explains why a city matters. Writing trained minds to think in sequences and categories, and that training spilled over into engineering, astronomy, and medicine. The link between writing, numbers, and administration created a toolkit that later societies would refine with paper, alphabets, and eventually printing. The heart of the change was simple. A ledger allowed a community to remember more than any living person could hold in their head. That shared memory gave cities endurance and gave rulers reach. 2000 to 1200 BC, Bronze Age connectivity and innovation. Bronze was more than a new metal. It was a supply chain that connected miners, smiths, sailors, and courts spread across continents. Tin was rare, copper was common, and their marriage required trade routes that crossed mountains and seas. A palace that wanted durable tools and fine weapons had to cultivate relationships with distant partners. Diplomatic letters and gift exchanges grew from that need, and royal archives recorded marriages that linked courts from the Aegean to the Levant. Chariots and the compound bow reshaped the battlefield and the hunt. These tools needed skilled horses, specialized wood, and steady training, which in turn required states to devote resources to stables and roads. War became more formal, and victory often went to those who managed logistics best. The prestige of chariotry also influenced art and ceremony, turning military elites into trendsetters who defined status across regions. Maritime trade created a floating highway for ideas as well as goods. Shipwrecks tell stories of mixed cargoes that included glass ingots, gold jewelry, pottery, and raw materials bound for urban markets. Port cities flourished as multilingual hubs where scribes could translate and merchants could settle disputes under agreed rules. The sea taught courts that cooperation could be profitable and that trust could be built beyond kinship. Craft specialization reached new heights as artisans learned to produce standardized goods at scale. Mold casting allowed large batches of similar items, while fine handwork remained prized for elite exchange. Workshops clustered near palaces, but also in lively neighborhoods where skills passed from master to apprentice. Quality improved because reputation mattered in long-distance trade, and marks of origin began to carry weight. The Bronze Age connected people who had never met into a network of mutual dependence. It also planted a vulnerability because complex systems can break when a single link fails. The next century would show how fragile prosperity can be when supply, climate, and security shift all at once. 1200 to 600 BC. Great disruption in the Iron Age. A chain of crises unsettled the old order and pushed societies to adapt or disappear. Migrations, raids, earthquakes, and droughts combined to break the web that had sustained palace economies. Some cities burned, others emptied, and elites lost their grip on the roots that once fed their courts. The fall of one kingdom was not the end of civilization. It was a forced reset that invited new players and new tools into the game. Iron moved from curiosity to everyday material because it was easier to find than tin and copper. Smelting it required higher heat and skill, but the reward was strong tools that could be made in more places. Farmers cleared land with tougher plowshares, and small communities equipped themselves without waiting for royal shipments. Power shifted downward in many regions as local leaders could arm followers without the patronage of a distant palace. Phoenician sailors stitched the sea lanes back together and spread an alphabet that made writing cheaper to learn. A script with fewer signs lowered the barrier to record-keeping and opened literacy to tradespeople outside temple schools. New colonies dotted the coasts from the eastern Mediterranean to the Atlantic, and these outposts acted like relay stations for language, art, and law. The map changed not only in borders, but in the texture of everyday communication. Religious and cultural creativity followed political upheaval. Poets preserved long memories in epic verse, lawgivers codified customs for cities finding their feet, and prophets called communities back to ethical roots. Small polities learned to work together through leagues and alliances when larger empires were absent or weak. The lesson of this period is that collapse is not a final chapter. It is a passage in which new institutions and identities can take shape. The Iron Age did more than change materials. It altered who could participate in public life by putting durable tools and simpler scripts within reach of more people. When access expands, imagination follows, and the stage is set for deeper rethinking of ethics and power. 800 to 200 BC, Axial Age Transformations. In several regions at once, thinkers asked bigger questions about duty, justice, and the nature of reality. Teachers in China debated how to build an orderly society that prized virtue over birth, while others urged harmony with the way of nature rather than the letter of law. In India, philosophers explored the self and the cycle of suffering and offered paths to release that did not depend on wealth or rank. Across Persia, ideas about a moral struggle in the cosmos encouraged individuals to choose truth over lies. Around the Mediterranean, inquiry turned outward and inward at the same time. Some minds pursued rational explanations for nature and experimented with geometry and observation. Others shaped dramas and histories that examined the fate of cities and the choices of leaders. Sacred texts in the Levant set ethical demands in stories and laws that bound communities through covenant rather than clan alone. The common thread was a shift from ritual performance to reflection on right conduct and meaning. These movements did not abolish earlier religions. They reframed them with a stronger emphasis on personal responsibility and universal claims. The idea that a humble person could live a worthy life without aristocratic lineage gained ground. Schools formed around texts and teachers, and debate became a path to knowledge rather than a threat to authority. Literacy grew as disciples copied sayings and commentaries to spread the message beyond one generation. Political leaders noticed that ideas could legitimize power more deeply than fear alone. Some rulers sponsored scholars and monastic communities, while others took counsel from philosophers who claimed that a well-governed state rested on virtue. The exchange went both ways because thinkers also learned that laws and institutions mattered if ideals were to survive contact with daily life. Thought and policy began a dialogue that would shape the next wave of empires. The Axial Age left a legacy of concepts that still anchor global conversations. Duty, compassion, truth, and reason gained sharper outlines, and communities could now imagine belonging defined by shared principles rather than ancestry. When the moral imagination expands, the possible shapes of a civilization multiply. 550 BC to 200 AD, classical empires and imperial governance. Empires learned to connect faraway provinces with roads, couriers, and bureaucrats who could count and tax. A great royal road could carry a message across a continent in a handful of days, and that speed made distant governors accountable to a center. Provinces kept their local customs under an umbrella of imperial law, which allowed diversity to become an asset rather than a constant source of rebellion. Coins with known purity and weight helped move goods and pay troops on time. Legal codes matured into practical tools for rule rather than only moral statements. Census-taking and land surveys let administrators plan harvest levies and military service with more accuracy. Standard languages for administration coexisted with local speech, allowing orders to be understood while culture remained varied. Merit-based promotion began to compete with birthright in some bureaucracies, which increased competence and loyalty. Conquest spread technologies and habits in both directions. Engineers who built canals, bridges, and frontier walls carried knowledge wherever they worked and trained local laborers who passed those techniques on to their children. Military veterans settled on new farms and connected their home region to a broader economy with markets and marriage. The result was a thickening mesh of relationships that made ideas travel farther and faster than caravans alone ever could. Cities and imperial cores grew into magnets for ambition and learning. Libraries gathered scrolls from many lands, and scholars compared languages, mythologies, and sciences. Legal professions emerged to navigate complex systems, and standardized education shaped a class of administrators who thought in similar categories. Public works, such as aqueducts and bathhouses, improved urban health and created common civic pride. The classical empires were laboratories of scale. They proved that a multi-ethnic realm could be governed with a blend of tolerance, infrastructure, and law. They also revealed the limits of expansion and the cost of overreach, setting the stage for new patterns of exchange that could survive when central power ebbed. 200 BC to 300 AD, trade ecologies of Afro Eurasia. A web of routes by land and sea turned local markets into parts of a single Old World economy. Caravans crossed deserts and steppes with silk, jade, and horses, while ships rode monsoon winds with pepper, cinnamon, and cotton. Merchants followed predictable seasons, and port cities became calendars made of stone and rope. Insurance by custom and credit by reputation allowed goods to move safely without a bank in the modern sense. Religions, stories, and artistic styles moved with cargoes. A statue from one region could appear in a shrine across the ocean, and a coin from another land could end up under the floor of a farmhouse far from its mint. Translators and brokers became essential figures who bridged languages and customs, earning trust by delivering fairness. Intermarriage among trading families knit distant harbors into extended kin networks that outlived any single merchant. States learned to nurture trade by protecting roads and patrolling coasts rather than taxing every wagon and boat to exhaustion. Warehouses and caravanserais offered food, water, and security at regular intervals, which cut losses and tempted more participants. Diplomatic gifts kept routes open when politics turned tense, and shared conventions about weights and measures made bargaining simpler even between strangers. The ecological side of commerce mattered because routes were shaped by climate and terrain. Oases determined desert paths, while reefs and currents dictated safe harbors. Traders became amateur naturalists who watched the sky and the water as closely as they watched prices. Knowledge of winds and stars was a competitive advantage and a cultural treasure passed down in families and guilds. This trading world integrated economies without erasing local identity. The port was a window, not a mirror, and people chose what to adopt. Over time, those choices remade diets, wardrobes, and toolkits in ways that no single ruler planned. Exchange wrote a quiet chapter of civilization in the language of appetite and curiosity. 1 to 700 AD religions of universal reach. Faiths that promised meaning for all people spread beyond the communities that first nurtured them. They carried scriptures that could be recited and translated, rituals that were recognizable across borders, and moral visions that appealed to farmers and princes alike. Conversion often began with friendship, as traders and neighbors shared stories and invited each other to gatherings where food and song made belonging tangible. Texts gave these movements endurance and reach. A gospel, a sutra, or a law code could be carried by a traveler and copied by a scribe in a distant town. Monasteries and schools turned devotion into education, preserving languages and promoting literacy. Pilgrimage ties created roads of the spirit that paralleled the roads of trade, and those pilgrim paths strengthened hospitality across cultures. Rulers saw in universal religions both opportunity and challenge. Endorsing a faith could unify a kingdom and soften internal divisions, yet it could also empower authorities outside the palace who claimed allegiance to a higher law. The most successful courts learned to balance patronage with prudence, sponsoring buildings and scholars while avoiding the temptation to turn belief into a blunt instrument. Everyday life changed as ethical teachings reshaped family habits, charity, and work. Sacred calendars punctuated the year with fasts and festivals that linked distant communities in shared time. The language of compassion and justice moved from sermons into market stalls and village councils. Religion became an architecture of identity that spanned language and class. Universal faiths built bridges between strangers by offering a story in which anyone could find a place. Those bridges often stood longer than treaties and outlasted dynasties. In that endurance lies a key to how civilizations weave cultural unity from diversity without wiping out local color. 200 to 700 AD, late antiquity, and post-classical reordering. An old world did not end in a single day. It morphed through pressure as borders shifted, taxes faltered, and new peoples entered old provinces. Cities shrank in some regions and blossomed in others, while rural estates tried to become more self-sufficient. The western half of a famous empire fragmented into successor kingdoms, while the eastern half held on with fortified cities, skilled diplomacy, and a powerful tax base. Farther east, new dynasties reunited river valleys and prepared the ground for commercial renewal. Law and culture were the glue in places where armies could no longer be everywhere at once. Codifications of legal practice gave judges and governors a map to follow, and church or temple hierarchies helped communities care for the poor and the sick when public services faltered. Literacy retreated from some frontiers, but deepened around centers of learning that preserved science and philosophy in multiple languages. Movement defined this era as migrants and conquerors remixed populations. Crafts traveled with people, and so did songs, saints, and stories. Frontier zones became corridors of creativity where new styles of art and architecture emerged from encounters that were sometimes peaceful and sometimes violent. The horse remained a symbol of speed and freedom on land, and steppe tactics challenged settled armies to adapt. Trade never entirely stopped because people still needed salt, iron, and textiles. Coastal shipping and river traffic kept regional economies alive even when long-distance caravans grew rare. Over time, routes revived as security improved and as new powers recognized the wealth that flowed through markets. Monasteries and caravan stations acted as islands of order, keeping memory and exchange alive. This period teaches that civilization does not vanish when capitals fall. It survives in habits, texts, and skills that can be carried in a pack or taught at a hearth. What emerges on the far side of turbulence often bears the stamp of what endured quietly in the Middle Years. 630 to 1000 AD Islamic expansion and a connected Old World, a new religious and political force surged from the Arabian Peninsula and transformed the map from Iberia to the Indus. Conquests moved quickly at first, but the deeper change was administrative and cultural. Cities became multilingual centers where scholars translated ancient learning into a shared tongue and then extended it with original research. Merchants found a vast zone where contracts, courts, and coinage felt familiar across great distances. Institutions of learning grew alongside markets. Observatories tracked the sky to improve calendars and navigation. Hospitals trained physicians who wrote clinical handbooks, and mathematicians refined algebra and algorithms that would later travel widely. Papermaking spread and lowered the cost of books, which multiplied libraries and nurtured debate. This investment in knowledge created a feedback loop in which practical needs drove inquiry, and inquiry returned practical tools. Religious law and commercial practice interacted in ways that encouraged trust among strangers. Judges could adjudicate disputes between partners from different cities because shared norms created predictable outcomes. Charitable endowments funded schools, bridges, and fountains, tying piety to public works. Diversity was managed through systems that granted local communities space to govern their internal affairs while contributing to the wider order. Trade routes thickened across land and sea. Caravans crossed deserts with escorts and guides who knew wells by memory, while ships sailed between East Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia with monsoon winds as their engine. Port cities adopted cosmopolitan flavors as languages mixed and cuisines blended. The flow of goods included not only luxuries, but also staples that stabilized prices and diets. The expansion brought strains as well as synergies. Frontier wars, succession disputes, and theological debates tested unity. Yet the larger pattern is clear. A connected zone of faith, law, and commerce linked the Western and Eastern Old World more tightly than before, paving the way for later integrations that would include new empires and new oceans. 960 to 1279 AD Song China and the First Commercial Revolution, urban life reached a new intensity as markets multiplied and money changed form. Paper currency appeared as a practical solution to moving value without hauling metal, and merchants learned to trust notes backed by reputable issuers. Iron production soared with better furnaces and water-powered bellows, feeding a boom in tools, nails, and weapons that made cities and farms more productive. Printing turned texts into a mass good, and education became a ladder many families could climb. A consumer culture took shape with shops that specialized in everything from tea to ceramics. City guides listed attractions and services, and tax policy adapted to a world where commerce was a larger share of wealth. Canals and roads moved grain and people with increasing reliability, and urban neighborhoods built guilds that protected standards and trained newcomers. The scale of exchange called for better accounting and record-keeping and sparked innovations in bookkeeping. Science and technology walked hand in hand with daily life. Engineers built bridges with new designs, shipwrights added stern-post rudders, and magnetic compasses improved navigation, and agronomists compiled handbooks that spread high-yield crops and better field techniques. Poetry and painting flourished in a culture that valued refined accomplishment, while examination systems selected officials through rigorous tests on texts and policy. The state leaned on talent, while talent leaned on print. The countryside did not vanish in the glow of the city. Farmers diversified crops and entered market networks with surplus tea, silk, and sugar. Household industries thrived as families spun and wove textiles for sale, blurring the line between farm and factory. Cash rents and wage labor became more common, and social mobility gained new roots through commerce and education. This commercial revolution did not use coal or steam, yet it previewed later industrial patterns. High literacy, deep markets, and complex supply chains created a society practiced in coordination. When a civilization learns to balance state capacity with private initiative, the ceiling of growth lifts. Americas before contact city-states and empires. Across the Atlantic, civilizations rose that built cities, roads, terraces, and calendars without borrowing from the Old World. In Mesoamerica, urban centers organized around plazas and pyramids, and scholars tracked time with astonishing precision. Farther north and south, great towns and regional polities developed unique art, trade networks, and ritual life. In the Andes, mountain engineers turned steep slopes into gardens with stonework that still holds soil against gravity and rain. States in these regions managed labor through communal obligations that knit villages to capitals. Storehouses held maize and potatoes against bad years, and runners on road systems carried messages faster than a single rider could manage on broken terrain. Craft specialists produced fine textiles and metalwork that signaled status and served ritual needs. Trade moved obsidian, jade, feathers, and salt over long distances through trusted routes. Knowledge flourished in astronomy, agriculture, and architecture. Observatories aligned buildings with solstices and equinoxes, letting farmers tune planting to the sky. Plant domestication produced a cornucopia of crops that would later transform diets around the world after contact. Builders learned to fit stones without mortar and to manage water with canals that sustained dense populations in varied climates. Religion grounded authority with narratives of origin and cycles of renewal. Priests and nobles shared power, and festivals tied communities to sacred landscapes. Warfare existed and could be fierce, yet polities also made alliances and created confederations to manage conflict and exchange. The political mosaic changed over centuries as centers rose and fell with climate shifts and internal strain. The civilizations of the Americas demonstrated that complexity has many paths. They remind us that writing is not the only path to record-keeping, and that the absence of draft animals does not preclude large-scale organization. Human ingenuity shaped different toolkits to meet local challenges, and those toolkits reveal a global truth. Civilizations are solutions to problems of food, meaning, and order. 800 to 1500 AD, Africa's golden ages of trade and state. On the savanna south of the Sahara, kingdoms rose along the routes that carried gold, salt, and ideas between the interior and the Mediterranean. Control of river crossings and wells brought revenue, and courts invested in justice to keep caravans coming. In great towns, scholars taught law and theology while merchants negotiated prices for dust and ingots that would become coins far away. The sound of a market day linked camel bells to praise poetry. Along the East African coast, coral stone cities faced the sea with elegant houses and busy harbors. Sailors timed departures to the seasons, and ships carried ivory, timber, and cloth to Arabia and India and returned with ceramics, spices, and beads. Language and marriage wove African, Arab, and Persian strands into a coastal culture that balanced local pride with ocean-wide horizons. Faith and trade walked together under minaret shadows. In the south, stone enclosures rose on plateaus that anchored regional power. Cattle wealth and control of trade routes sustained elites who sponsored craftwork and ritual. Inland and coast were not strangers. Goods moved by canoe, porter, and pack animal, linking mines to markets with chains of trust that needed generations to build and a storm to break. Education and art marked these ages with lasting signatures. Manuscripts in desert towns preserved law and philosophy, while oral histories kept genealogy and memory alive where paper was rare. Music and sculpture carried history in forms that could be performed and touched, shaping identity with rhythm and texture. The balance between spoken and written word kept culture resilient across change. The golden ages of African trade and statecraft prove that prosperity flows where security, fairness, and imagination align. They also show that the continent was not a periphery waiting to be discovered. It was a generator of value and ideas that turned the compass of the Old World toward its markets and schools. 1200 to 1350 AD, the Mongol moment, and Eurasian integration. A confederation of steppe peoples forged the largest land empire of its time and redefined what a connected continent could look like. Riders moved with speed that shocked settled states, but the lasting change came after conquest when routes were secured and tribute was regularized. Artisans and scholars were moved across regions to where their skills were needed, and this purposeful relocation mixed techniques in novel combinations. Even enemies learned to negotiate with the new order to keep commerce alive. Postal stations and wayhouses created a chain of rest and supply that stretched across deserts and mountains. Official passports allowed travelers to move with protection, and banditry fell on main routes where enforcement was serious. The result was a safe corridor where silk, paper, glass, and fragrances moved with fewer losses than before. Traders calculated risk with new confidence and expanded their ventures accordingly. Ideas rode in the same saddlebags. Gunpowder, printing practices, and medical knowledge traveled with merchants and envoys. Maps incorporated fresh information, and cosmopolitan cities grew where caravan routes crossed. Religious leaders debated doctrines in courts that sometimes welcomed diverse opinions for pragmatic reasons. The exchange was lopsided at times, but curiosity opened doors that fear might have kept closed. The empire was not gentle in all places. Cities that resisted could be destroyed and populations uprooted. Yet once submission was secured, a surprising tolerance often governed daily interaction. Local laws and leaders remained in place under oversight that valued revenue and order. This stance allowed economic life to recover more quickly than total replacement would have allowed. The Mongol moment functioned as a great accelerator. By lowering the cost of moving goods and knowledge, it made the old world feel smaller and faster. When the system later fractured, the memory of what had been possible lingered and inspired later rulers and merchants to rebuild the routes with their own means. 1400 to 1550 AD, Renaissance, state finance, and new elites. A new confidence in human capacity, born of recovered texts and fresh wealth, remade parts of Europe. City republics and courts invested in art that celebrated civic pride and individual achievement, while bankers learned to move money with letters and clearinghouses that lowered risk. Double-entry bookkeeping turned enterprise into a discipline with a grammar, and credit markets made ambitious projects possible without royal treasure alone. Taxation and borrowing linked rulers and merchants in a partnership that could build fleets and hire professional armies. Diplomats crafted resident embassies to manage constant negotiation among competitive states, and information became a currency as valuable as silver. Printing presses multiplied pamphlets and treatises so quickly that ideas could outrun censorship, and literacy spread beyond clerical circles into the middling ranks of artisans and traders. Education shifted to emphasize rhetoric, history, and moral philosophy as tools for public life, while universities kept training lawyers, doctors, and theologians. The combination produced officials who could argue, calculate, and govern with a sense of precedent and prudence. Patronage remained important, yet talent could rise through service and skill, creating new elites whose prestige came from accomplishment as much as ancestry. Trade widened with better charts and ships that could safely tack into the wind. Insurance became more sophisticated, and risk was spread across investors who understood both danger and potential. Commodities such as sugar and dyes began to reshape labor and land use, foreshadowing the larger transformations that would follow when oceans tied continents together. The Renaissance was more than an art show. It was a financial and institutional upgrade that taught societies how to mobilize resources for complex tasks. When money finds method and method finds purpose, the capacity to build and explore grows quickly. 1450 to 1700 AD, gunpowder empires, and early modern consolidation. Canons spoke a new political language, and rulers who mastered that language stitched vast territories into durable states. In Anatolia and the Balkans, along the Iranian plateau, and across the Indo-Gangetic plain, courts invested in artillery, drilled infantry who could stand steady with matchlocks, and fortresses designed to absorb blasts rather than merely repel arrows. This was more than firepower. It was administration, payrolls, logistics, and law evolving to feed and pay men who no longer fought only for a lord but for a state. Ottoman scribes tallied land revenues with care because a well-supplied frontier demanded accurate ledgers. Safavid silk and taxation funded armies, even as court workshops shaped a distinctive style that advertised authority in color and script. Mughal revenue surveys measured fields with bamboo rods and translated grain into silver, then into soldiers on campaign and architects at work. The bond between paperwork and powder grew tighter with every siege and march. Religious legitimacy did not fade in the boom of guns. It adapted, blessing rule while also restraining it with expectations of justice and order. Judges adjudicated disputes in mixed cities where markets were crowded with languages from 3 continents, and petitions climbed from the street to the palace with surprising speed when procedure was respected. The promise of fairness drew merchants into imperial orbits because predictable courts were as valuable as safe roads. Cities flourished as capitals became magnets for craft and scholarship. Mosques, gardens, bridges, and caravanserai declared a vision of public life where beauty served piety and commerce at once. Artisans learned from each other across borders because gifts, embassies, and the movement of captive specialists spread techniques in textiles, ceramics, and metal. An imperial court that prized skill created ladders for talent, even for those born far from power. What held these realms together was a triangle of force, revenue, and legitimacy. Cannons opened gates, taxes kept them, and law made the conquest feel like order rather than occupation. The early modern world took shape in this balance, and the rhythm of state growth began to sound like the steady beat of a trained infantry line. 1492 to 1700 AD. Oceans unite the world. Voyages and the Columbian Exchange. Sails turned the planet into a connected stage when mariners linked Atlantic winds to Asian seas and American shores. Astrolabes and improved charts met ambition in crowded harbors, and wooden hulls carried crews who learned the moods of currents and the timing of storms. A ship became a moving market where language, faith, and law had to find temporary accommodations so that risk could be shared and profit divided. The Columbian Exchange remade diets faster than most conquests remade laws. Maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and cacao crossed oceans and settled in new soils, while wheat, sugarcane, horses, and cattle traveled the other way. Population curves bent upward in many regions because calories multiplied and fields yielded new combinations. Food became a global archive of journeys, and every kitchen today preserves that memory with its staples. Silver from the Americas poured through Spanish ports and then into Asian markets, where it unlocked trade in silk, porcelain, and spices. Manila sat at the crossing point, a city of merchants and sailors where Chinese wares met American bullion under an Iberian flag. The metal tied prices together across oceans so that a drought in one land could nudge markets far away, a delicate connection not easily seen from any single shore. The ocean network had a human cost that still echoes. Coerced labor moved with cargoes, and plantation frontiers devoured lives as sugar, tobacco, and later coffee reshaped landscapes and work. Resistance, creativity, and community emerged in the teeth of that exploitation as people forged new identities out of trauma and hope, building families, music, and faith that could survive storms of power. Oceans taught statecraft a new lesson. Whoever mastered navigation, credit, and violence at sea could influence faraway politics without garrisons on every hill. The maritime turn multiplied possibilities and dangers at once, and the planet felt smaller in the way a room feels smaller when it is crowded and loud. 1540 to 1800 AD, Scientific Revolution and Enlightenment. Curiosity found new instruments and new rules, and knowledge began to grow by experiment rather than authority. Telescopes showed moons circling a planet that was not Earth, while microscopes revealed worlds inside a drop of water. Natural philosophers started to record their methods alongside their claims so that others could repeat the steps and verify the result. That simple habit of transparency changed the power of a page. Societies for inquiry assembled in cities and published journals that stitched thinkers together across borders. A letter posted in one winter might provoke an experiment the following spring and a theory by autumn, and that cadence became the hum of a new intellectual economy. Mathematics turned from a school subject into a universal language of nature, allowing predictions that ships, mills, and artillery found immediately useful. Philosophers asked whether political life could be rebuilt on reasoned consent rather than inherited command. They debated rights, property, punishment, and the proper scope of the state, while printers spread pamphlets that invited artisans and merchants into the conversation. Coffee houses and salons became classrooms without walls, where tradespeople and nobles could trade ideas with a freedom that surprised both. Faith did not vanish under this lamp of reason. Believers argued for a moral order that could live with science, and many scientists were devout. The real rupture was not with heaven, but with the habit of sheltering customs from scrutiny. Once citizens learned to ask for reasons in physics and chemistry, they grew more comfortable asking for reasons in taxation and law. The scientific revolution and the Enlightenment taught societies how to disagree productively and how to turn argument into improvement. Tools, institutions, and expectations aligned so that observation corrected theory and theory sharpened observation. Out of that loop came inventions and reforms that the next century would test in the loudest ways. 1776 to 1848 AD, Atlantic revolutions, and the end of many old regimes. Pamphlets, assemblies, and battlefields redrafted the social contract around oceans that had recently become highways. Colonists argued that representation should match taxation and that citizens could design governments rather than inherit them. Declarations made bold claims about rights that belonged to people because they were human and not because they were favored. The written word became a weapon that could travel faster than an army. In Europe, crisis and ambition pulled down a monarchy and tried to erect a new order that treated law as the king and not the other way around. Armies marched for principles as well as territory, spreading codes that simplified law and widened civil equality, even as war demanded sacrifice. The vocabulary of the citizen expanded across borders and entered villages that once knew only local lords and customary dues. Across the Caribbean, enslaved people read the news of rights and recognize themselves in the promise. Uprisings shattered the assumption that bondage was permanent and created a republic born from resistance to a brutal system. The reverberations traveled to ports and plantations across the Atlantic, forcing lawmakers and merchants to confront the contradiction between profit and the ideals printed on their walls. In Latin America, juntas and liberators turned the crisis of European empires into an opening for independence. New flags rose over capitals, and constitutions attempted to balance central authority with regional rights in lands of staggering diversity. The difficulty of building unity out of mountains and plains, cities and ranches, tested patience and imagination in equal measure. The Atlantic revolutions did not produce a single model. They produced a contested field where liberty, equality, order, and prosperity had to be negotiated in every generation. Politics became a craft that many wanted to learn, and the idea of a people governing themselves refused to retreat. 1760 to 1870 AD, Industrialization and Urban Society First Wave. Steam turned heat into motion on demand, and that trick rewrote work. Textile machines multiplied the output of a single pair of hands, and factory whistles organized time with a precision that churches and town halls had never attempted. Coal mines became the dark engines below a new economy, while railways stitched regions into markets that could ignore winter roads and summer mud. Cities swelled with migrants who traded village rhythms for wages and rent. Rows of brick houses, crowded courts, and new streets created neighborhoods where strangers learned to share courtyards, water pumps, and news. The working day had a clock at the door, and the evening needed affordable food, light, and warmth. Shopkeepers and mutual aid societies evolved to meet needs that kin once met. Children entered mills and workshops, and reformers organized to limit hours and raise standards. Doctors mapped disease in crowded districts and began to argue for clean water as a public duty, while engineers designed pipes and sewers that quietly lengthened lives. Lawmakers discovered that health and education were not luxuries, but investments that kept factories staffed and streets calm. The middle classes wrote manuals on respectability, turned parlors into showcases of taste, and sent sons to learn accounting and daughters to learn music and literature. Newspapers multiplied, carrying reports from foreign ports and editorials on tariffs and wages. A sense of national conversation grew because trains carried the same headlines into towns far apart, and the telegraph taught business to think in minutes rather than days. Industrialization's first rush was a mixed blessing, as smoky prosperity arrived with noise, injury, and upheaval. Yet the capacity to generate abundance on a scale unknown to agrarian centuries had unmistakable power. The question that followed everywhere was how to distribute that power without burning the social fabric. 1870 to 1914 AD, high imperialism, nationalism, and mass migration. Steel rails, steam turbines, and chemical dyes turned factories into giants and made distance feel negotiable. With new strength, industrial states projected influence abroad, claiming ports and frontiers that promised resources and markets. Maps with colored patches in schoolrooms taught children to see the world as a set of possessions and routes, and newspapers praised faraway ventures as proof of national vigor. Competition among states wore a new uniform called nationalism. Flags, anthems, and public schools fostered unity inside borders even as rivalries sharpened outside them. Leaders learned to measure prestige by miles of railway, tonnage of ships, and numbers in regiments, and that arithmetic pushed policy toward risk. The idea that a people should rule itself energized movements in Europe and beyond, sometimes against empires and sometimes in their name. People moved on a scale that astonished earlier centuries. Millions crossed oceans to build new lives in cities that offered steady work and crowded tenements. Diasporas kept ties to homelands through letters and savings, reshaping both sending and receiving societies with food, language, and ambition. Remittances became a quiet river of capital that families navigated with care. Knowledge crossed borders with similar energy. Medical advances tamed infections that once ruled childhood, and new universities taught engineering, geology, and economics in step with industry. Telegraph cables on the ocean floor gave markets a nervous system, and news could spark price changes in places the reporter had never seen. The globe felt like a web with tension everywhere at once. High imperialism promised order and profit, but often delivered disruption and grievance. Resistance took many forms, from petitions to strikes to insurgency. The world was learning to be both connected and contested, a combination that would make the next shock travel quickly. 1914 to 1945 AD, total war and global ideologies. A regional crisis ignited alliances like dry grass, and mechanized armies ground across trenches that scarred the earth. Machine guns, heavy artillery, and gas made courage alone insufficient, and logistics became the true measure of a campaign. Civilians discovered that the front could reach them through rationing, requisition, and the arrival of casualty lists at the door. After the guns fell silent, new promises and new fears filled the vacuum. Some societies attempted to rebuild prosperity through markets and parliaments, while others rallied behind parties that offered unity through discipline and myth. Economic collapse in the Middle Years brought unemployment and anger, and competing visions for the future recruited followers with breadlines and banners. War returned with tanks, aircraft, and fleets that could span oceans. Entire economies reorganized around production targets for vehicles, munitions, and ships, and science moved into laboratories with military deadlines. Radio tied leaders to populations in an intimate loop of speech and response, while codebreakers and planners practiced a new craft of information war that would outlast the fighting. The moral catastrophe of systematic persecution and mass murder revealed how fragile civilization can be when hate and bureaucracy cooperate. Yet even in this darkness, individuals and groups risked everything to shield neighbors, smuggle children, and keep conscience alive. The end of the conflict left ruins and a determination in many quarters to prevent a third descent. Total war tested every institution and showed that technology magnifies both virtue and vice. The aftermath forced nations to reconsider sovereignty, human rights, and international cooperation with a seriousness born of exhaustion and grief. 1945 to 1991 AD, Cold War decolonization and development. Two superpowers faced each other with arsenals that made direct conflict unthinkable and proxy contests likely. Alliances framed security, and doctrines of deterrence attempted to keep the peace, by promising consequences too dire to risk. The globe divided into blocks, even as trade and culture continued to leak across borders through music, film, and academic exchange. Empires unraveled as movements for independence gained confidence and support. New flags appeared at the United Nations, and leaders debated how to forge growth out of colonial legacies. Some chose state-led planning, others welcomed private capital, and many mixed both while searching for stability. The challenges were immense, yet gains in literacy, vaccination, and infrastructure changed daily life for hundreds of millions. Social movements reshaped established democracies from within. Campaigns for civil rights, women's equality, and expanded social protections pushed laws to match ideals. Welfare states broadened safety nets in wealthy countries, while export-led strategies took hold in parts of East Asia where disciplined investment in education and industry paid visible dividends. Science and exploration reached for the sky and beyond. Satellites turned the planet into a monitored system, weather forecasts lengthened, and the first steps on the moon made a shared human moment visible to anyone with a television. Computers shrank from rooms to desks, and early networks taught institutions to share data across long distances. The end of the Cold War arrived faster than most expected, opening questions about security, markets, and governance that would dominate the next chapter. The lesson of the period was paradoxical. Division created innovation through competition, while the hope of peace promised to redirect that energy toward integration. 1970 to 2008 AD, Globalization, Information, and Market Revolutions. A metal box called the shipping container did quiet magic by standardizing how goods move from factory to ship to truck. Costs fell, delivery times shortened, and distant suppliers could plug into production chains as if they lived next door. Deregulation in finance and transportation amplified these efficiencies, and companies learned to manage inventories with software that treated warehouses like flowing streams rather than stagnant pools. Computers left laboratories and entered homes, then pockets. The internet allowed messages to ignore distance and time zones, and email collapsed the workday into a single continuous conversation. Search engines organized knowledge into maps that anyone could query, and new firms built services on top of that shared infrastructure. Open-source communities proved that collaboration at scale could produce tools as robust as those made inside corporations. Markets globalized in sudden leaps. Factories moved to places with skilled labor and lower costs, while design and branding stayed in established hubs. Capital slipped across borders at the speed of light, rewarding insight and punishing missteps with breathtaking speed. Aspirations rose alongside incomes in many regions, even as some communities felt left behind by plant closures and wage stagnation. Culture turned into an exchange as intense as trade in goods. Music, films, and sports found global audiences, and cuisines cross-pollinated with an ease that made city streets feel like festivals of the world. At the same time, local traditions learned to market themselves without losing soul, and tourism became a major industry with both benefits and strains for host communities. The decade that ended in 2008 revealed a fragility under the glossy surface. Financial innovations outran prudence, risk models blinked in the face of reality, and a crisis rippled from mortgages to markets worldwide. The recovery would shape politics and policy for years, and the faith in unregulated efficiency would not return unchanged. 2008 to the present day, multipolar world, digital platforms, and the Anthropocene. A shock in finance gave way to a wave of platforms that reorganized daily life around handheld screens. Ride-hailing, home sharing, and social networking turned phones into portals for services and friendships, while algorithms learned from clicks to keep attention in their grip. Work shifted for many toward gigs and remote tasks, and new questions arose about privacy, data ownership, and the power of a few firms to shape public conversation. International politics tilted toward multipolar competition as rising powers asserted regional interests and older powers reassessed commitments. Supply chains, once celebrated for efficiency, were reconsidered for resilience after disruptions from disasters, trade disputes, and public health emergencies. Energy systems began to pivot more seriously toward wind, sun, and storage as costs fell and climate concerns matured into policy. Science moved at a pace that surprised even optimists. Gene editing offered tools to fight disease, and new vaccines arrived with unprecedented speed when a pandemic demanded action. Artificial intelligence improved pattern recognition in medicine, logistics, and language, while also raising hard questions about bias, accountability, and employment. The line between the physical and the digital blurred as sensors and software saturated streets, farms, and factories. The planet's limits entered mainstream planning under the name Anthropocene, a recognition that human activity now rivals geological forces. Cities mapped heat, nations priced carbon, and communities experimented with adaptation from seawalls to drought-tolerant crops. Justice gained a central place in environmental debates because the burdens and benefits of growth had never been evenly shared. Today's world is a moving puzzle where technology, ecology, and geopolitics lock together in changing ways. The opportunity is vast because knowledge is widely distributed and tools are powerful. The risk is real because coordination is hard at global scale. The next steps will test whether civilizations can upgrade cooperation as quickly as they have upgraded machines. The long arc of civilization. Civilization began as a wager that strangers could share rules and reap more from the land than any lone family could manage. Grain in a jar allowed a plan that stretched beyond a single season. Then writing turned memory into an institution that could outlive its author. With every new tool for cooperation, communities widen the circle of trust, from village to city to network. The shape of that circle has never stopped changing because each generation inherits both a toolkit and a set of promises to keep. Power has always rested on three pillars that shift and rebalance with time. Energy provides muscle, information provides coordination, and legitimacy provides consent. Irrigation coupled to tablets, ships coupled to ledgers, steam coupled to telegraph, and circuits coupled to code. When those couplings align with fair rules, prosperity deepens and participation grows. When they fall out of tune, societies feel strain as inequality climbs and confidence thins. The most reliable engine of progress has been connection that preserves difference while enabling exchange. Ports, roads, and fiber made it easier to move goods and ideas without erasing local identity. The best race learned to value curiosity over fear and to turn diversity into a source of insight rather than a line of fracture. That habit of learning from neighbors is not a luxury. It is the method by which civilizations avoid becoming brittle. Risk has traveled the same roads as reward, from droughts that humbled early kingdoms to pandemics that tested modern systems. Each shock exposed weak links and forced invention. Public health, insurance, and disaster planning rose from hard lessons learned at great cost. Resilience is not only a matter of stockpiles and walls. It depends on trust that lets people share burdens quickly when the unexpected arrives. The next chapter will be written in a world where human activity rivals geological forces and where code touches nearly every choice. That reality asks for institutions that are fast without being reckless, and for markets that are dynamic without being blind to consequences. History's clearest message is practical and hopeful at once. When knowledge is shared widely, when rules are seen as fair, and when imagination is welcomed, civilizations do not simply endure. They adapt with grace and discover futures that once seemed out of reach. If you enjoyed this video, then don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel for more ominous history documentaries. See you in the next one.